All right, the review of the diagnostic analysis. If you don't have a copy of this, there are extra copies over here on the table, so feel free to grab one of those if you don't have one of those in hand. The goal here is to reach general consensus guided by that wonderful, beautiful principle in Ephesians chapter 4. You see it on the screen there. And there are two parts to this review. The first part is I'm going to give you just some quick highlights, which are in reality are barely scratching the surface. There's so much in this report that I can't fully and thoroughly review it with you without taking up all the time that we have. The second part will be your questions, comments, and corrections possibly as you're paging through the report. So I'm going to walk you through it real quickly and then get your reaction, and you can talk about anything that I have shared with you as in terms of the highlights or anything else that you ran across in the report that you felt you have a question about or a comment on, again, maybe a correction. So here are the highlights as I recorded them. First of all, on page 3, there's an introduction there. And on page 4, ministry content and consensus is the first major part of the report. On page 4, number 1 there, your context for gospel ministry, I'll emphasize the following. The most significant events or challenges in recent years for Trinity: change in pastoral leadership, changing demographics in the area, resulting in increasing diversity. And the third one, growth of movement out of Crete and out of Illinois, primarily into Indiana. Number 2, on page 16, jumping right ahead, your consensus on carrying out ministry. Top 3 concerns of members in terms of what needs more emphasis in our congregation. You said number 1, teens. Number 2, the straying and the strayed. And number 3, outreach. 79.6% of your surveyed members say some or significant change is needed at Trinity. The higher the percentage, the easier it is to bring about change. The lower the percentage, the more resistant people are to change because they're happy with the way things are, with the status quo. 80%, 79.6% is not really high. Most congregations I serve, I'll say 85% of them maybe are in the 90s, low 90s or upper 80s. So, you might find a little more resistance to change here in some areas, depending on the change that's being suggested and so on. On page 22, we're under the category here, strengths on which to build. First strength, God's pure and powerful word. Trinity has been a Christian congregation for about 171 years from the time services were begun. You became a Wells congregation in 1966. Prior to that, you were Missouri. Because God's word is truth and spirit-driven power, this is your congregation's number 1 strength, without question. Your connection to the truth of God's word and the power of that truth is your number 1 strength. Number 2, page 23, substantial member ministry. You've been blessed for many years with substantial member ministry, due in part or perhaps primarily because of your PMM program. This ministry planning process is an opportunity to assess and then take PMM and every other ministry program at Trinity to the next possible level with God's guidance and blessing, of course. On page 24, your pastors and other staff, and by the way, Pastor Cook was not able to be here today, is that correct? Yep. Okay, just so that you know, he's not, sleeping in or something. The Lord has blessed Trinity with 2 well-trained and dedicated pastors and with other staff members who are highly committed to their respective roles. We commend Trinity for purposefully positioning your part-time staff members based on their individual interests, talents, and passions to assist you in advancing your ministry. On page 25, your commitment to strategic planning. Trinity's commitment to planning, including honest analysis, God-honoring goal setting and focused implementation is commendable. Trinity has benefited and will continue to benefit from your current as well as future cycles of strategic ministry planning. Number 5 is Illinois Lutheran Schools on page 26. We were not asked to analyze your school system, but we couldn't ignore it because it's a huge blessing to both you here at Trinity and Zion. And 50 to 75% of your new members at Trinity come from contacts connected with your school system. So it's your primary feeder in terms of growth within the congregation. Our encouragement: cooperate and coordinate fully with Zion to ensure that your school system remains a strength that benefits both congregations. On page 26, new heading here, significant issues to address. Your member spiritual health is number 1. The What I Believe survey results raised some red flags and underscored the need for all to take Bible study more seriously and commit to participating. It's only through the Word and the power of the Spirit working in our hearts and lives that we will know the truth, have hope for the future, and be like-minded in pursuing God's will. On page 28, prioritize adult spiritual growth. Trinity needs a greater emphasis on adult spiritual growth, an enhanced adult spiritual growth program, and widespread participation. Your consultants were equally concerned back in 2014 when you went through another comprehensive ministry planning process. We called this one out as a significant issue at that time. We agree with the member who concluded spiritual growth is the engine that drives all the other areas of our ministry and our family life. On page 30, number 3, outreach to a culturally diverse community. We cited an author who recommends 3 shifts in congregations at this point in time in the 21st century. Number 1 is the shift from a temple mindset to a network mindset. Second, shift from an attractional mindset to an incarnational mindset. There's a little paragraph under each of these to explain what he's talking about there. And number 3, shift from traditional forms and structures to innovative ones. Good news here, your Board of Outreach and Executive Board are focusing on how best to reach more people in your diverse community. And maybe these 3 points here will assist you in that. On page 32, point 4, youth-focused ministry expansion. Members ranked teen program number 1 out of 9 areas when asked what one major area do you feel should receive more emphasis in your congregation. Trinity's leaders and a growing number of other members are recognizing the need to expand youth-focused ministry at Trinity, including enhancing service roles for teens and 20-somethings, maybe also people in their 30s. On page 32, needed facility improvements. The Trinity Elementary School building has been a concern for some time, but this is now being addressed. Also, you have plans to provide a facelift in this building, and that'll soon be underway. Ministry program, big heading coming up now on page 35, starting with worship. Worship was ranked highest in program priority by members, leaders, pastors, and other staff, specifically referring to your part-time staff. And all indicated that worship preparation should be the highest priority for their pastor's use of time. 83% of your surveyed members indicated that worship for them was usually helpful or consistently inspiring. Compare that with the average that we run into in congregations overall, 75%, so higher. On page 40, adult discipleship. Compare these pre-COVID 2019 percentages of confirmed members participating weekly in Bible study. Trinity, 5.3%. Chicago conference that you're a part of, 15%. and your synod 15.2%. And it's often mentioned that the synod is woefully inadequate, the synod average of 15.2. You're way down there at 5.3%. One of the lowest, by the way, I've seen in probably years in congregations that I'm serving. You're poised to ask people to make changes in their lives leading to greater spiritual maturity. Adult spiritual growth must be one of your most significant ministry programs in order for positive advances in ministry to occur. And again, that's because it's foundational. That's because it's where we come to a clearer understanding of what God's will is, and empowered by God's grace, by the gospel, to live out His will in our lives. On page 42, Outreach and Evangelism. Trinity is doing some great things for outreach, but still leaders graded outreach a C-, and 26% of your engaged members, the people who filled out the survey, indicated that outreach is not meeting needs or barely passing. Even again, I'll emphasize, even though you're doing some really great things, more things I think than most congregations are doing in relationship to their community. You currently store 3 different prospect lists in 3 different places. You may find it more efficient to use your CCB software to combine your lists as you farm your prospects. On page 46, Reclaiming the Strayed and Straying. This received a pretty low grade, D as in dog, D, by leaders, and was ranked number 2 by members in needing more emphasis. You identified 377 communicant members. 377 communicant members, or 42% of your communicant members, as inactive, and that's pre-COVID 2019. And your definition for inactivity: had not attended church in 2019. So very charitable definition. You can be gone for a year from church before we put you in that column of being inactive. You're beginning to address this need, happy to mention. You're rolling out the much needed member care teams and more, as you'll read about in that section. On page 47, Group Life and Fellowship. COVID has dramatically impacted fellowship life at Trinity, and every other congregation, of course, and many are looking forward to fellowship returning to the way it used to be. And we're encouraging you to establish a strategic plan for fellowship opportunities post-COVID, to reconnect your members to one another, both special one-time events and those you do regularly. On page 49, Ministry to Children, Youth, and their Families. ILS, of course, is a huge asset again. Youth and young adult ministry received the D grade from leaders. The 2 Ds were Reclaiming the Strayed and Straying, and Ministry to Children, Youth, and their Families. And the D grade had a lot to do with the teens, or it was specifically related to teens. Sunday School, Boy and Girl Pioneers, VBS, Teen Ministry, 20s and 30s, all in your report there. Quite a bit of ground to cover. Our encouragement: promote everything you're doing with children, with youth, with families, within your community as much as possible. Page 52, Member Ministry. Your PMM program has been and remains a shining star at Trinity. We encourage you to strive for balance as you take a hard look at what you're asking your members to do. One of the things that we heard from a number of people is that there are so many different activities, so many things going on. It gets kind of confusing. We're not even aware of everything that's going on, and sometimes people have felt kind of stretched. Oftentimes the most active people, like the people sitting here and other active members in the congregation, are involved in other things, and then they're involved in additional things on top of that. One of the principles that's kind of a healthy principle to keep in mind, that no member should be involved in more than 2 things within a congregation. That's besides worship and besides, Bible study. 2 different activities or 2 different, whatever, because life is just too packed otherwise. Financial stewardship. Page 54, we heard Trinity has some really capable numbers people who are gifted at managing the congregation's asset. That always helps. You have no debt. That's helpful too, especially when you're launching into and setting a new ministry plan. Giving to outside causes represented 19.7% of your total giving in 2019. That's fantastic. That's almost 20%. Of every dollar that comes in, 20 cents goes out of your congregation. So you're kind of double tithing as a congregation. Now, a lot of that is Illinois Lutheran Schools, which is separate identity, a big one that you have. CMO, congregational mission offerings. Yes?
I was going to say, ILS actually is about just under 50%. So the 20% would be Synod and missions, I would think.
Right.
Say that again?
So ILS is about 50% of our budget.
Of your budget?
Yeah.
Spending money.
Oh, so that's not even included in
Yeah,
here?
that's not included in that.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Thanks. Appreciate that. All right. At the same time, your collective giving for all purposes, in other words, all the revenue that you receive in way of offerings, is 1.8% of your combined income potential. And we figure the combined income potential of that ministry area that we identified, and we did the Mission Insight study on. We take the per capita income and we multiply it times the number of people in your congregation. And when we take how much you gave to the congregation in 2019, or how much revenue came in way of offerings, divided by that big number of whatever it was, 33 million or something, I can't remember. That's where we get the 1.8%. So that's lower than the Wells average of 2.4%. So that makes the generosity of your congregation, that 19.7%, and the Illinois Lutheran Schools, all the income that goes out to them, especially impressive when your overall giving is lower than in the Wells. Ongoing training in financial stewardship principles is essential. God's people need to know what their Lord says about this faith-related subject. Also, annually promote planned giving. I think congregation more and more at this point in time in history, where we've got a lot of builders and silents and boomers aging and so forth, and younger generations coming in, many of whom are not grounded in the Word of God because we don't have as many kids and youth involved in those activities in congregations these days. That planned giving through wills and estates and so forth is going to be an increasingly important source of revenue for our churches in the future. On page 58, number 9, administration, leadership, organization, communication. The 3 administrative components mentioned in this section are each significant when striving for congregational health through faithful management of God's resources. Looking to the future, think teams, and you're already doing some of this, of course, teams of men and women as you multiply ministry through your members. After establishing your vision for future ministry, align your congregational system, your organizational structure, so you can better implement your ministry plans. And that's definitely on the radar here. You want to look at your organizational system, engage youth more, and engage women more within your system. On page 60, rapid action recommendations. The first one, keep gathering names for your prospect list and faithfully farm it. We didn't realize that you had as many households on your prospect list as we came to know following the on-site analysis. So this was mentioned as a rapid action recommendation, something urgent to get at. I would say what's urgent now is to figure out how you can take all of those 3 different lists and combine them somehow and work that list, because otherwise it's so easy for people to fall through the cracks. Number 2, establish and review your guiding principles for music and worship. Number 3, develop a plan to study the principles of the roles of men and women. And 4, develop additional lay-led growth groups, and I think you're working on all of those, aren't you? You've completed, I think, one or two of them and are working on the others. And then on page 61, some challenges. On 62, next steps, and those next steps are happening now, today, and a word of thanks. All right, so that's my quick review. Some highlights, and again, barely scratching the surface of the contents of the report. Time though for your questions, your comments, maybe more additional corrections. Anybody? Go ahead, please.
Page 24, I'm kind of curious which of our members, our pastors are like Jordan and Pippen. Jordan and Pippen are approximately the same height. So,
Yeah, I'm not sure they were referencing their height.
I-
By the way,
I
no. And by the way, I also remember that in that context, when that came up, somebody said, we'll let them figure out who is who. Which one is which. Okay, good. All right, did I see your hand?
I was just gonna say, maybe another word of encouragement was, all this information was compiled with the numbers that we have as far as people in congregation. And I think everybody in this room knows that we really don't have a congregation of 1,000, 10 or 20. If you take, maybe 200 of those off of there to get down to about the 800 number, these numbers are gonna skew up,
Yeah,
I think, so,
Maybe 400 then.
yeah.
Maybe more like 400.
Now, that's true, but that's also true of almost all other congregations.
yeah.
Unfortunately, the truest measure of a congregation is the average worship attendance. And over the last, really, decade or two, I think, churches, including Synodical, we've kind of gravitated toward the worship average number because it's more honest, it's more truthful. You can talk about 1,000 or 1,200 members or whatever. What does that mean if you only have a third of them in worship? Now, you'll have other people within that larger number that occasionally come and so forth. And one of the things I'll be talking about with you about in the future is how a congregation needs to think in terms of moving members up. Moving members up. You've got your inactives down here. There's always a percentage there. And the next layer up is those who are coming to church, but that's about all they're doing. The next layer up is those who are active in ministry. They're serving. That's your core. And a step above the core are elected leaders who are in positions of leadership. And the goal, when you really break it all down, the goal in the congregation, besides the big two goals of nurture and outreach, growing people up, equipping them to serve, equipping them to witness, and sending them out to get more. I mean, that's the big picture, right? This way of looking at things here is that the congregation and your programming and your efforts and on your calendar and everything should be geared at moving people up. So you take the people who aren't even coming to church, your goal for them is what? Get them in church, get them exposed to the means of grace. And you take those who are at that level just coming to church and you want to connect them, with other people in the congregation and give them a role in service and get them into Bible class. And the next layer up is that's your core, your active serving people. Well, if you're moving people up, that keeps growing, right? And ultimately the leadership at the top, those are the ones that kind of, have their hand on the rudder, steering everything. They're also the ones that people shoot arrows at. So they've got to be spiritually mature enough to handle criticism, because leaders often get criticized, especially when they're making things happen. Positive things happen that make some people uncomfortable. And so this whole idea of moving people up is pretty significant in my mind. Because if we're not focused on that, we just let people sit where they're at in their particular role, and we're not moving forward as a congregation, if that makes sense. Other comments, Lori?
Just in reaction to that, give us an example of how we know who those people are, how we're tracking that, how we're getting those lists in front of people so they know who they should be helping take that next step.
A couple of congregations that I've served in the not too distant past took their entire membership and put them in 4 categories, or put them in however many categories they want. You hate to think of, okay, we're categorizing our members, but it's for the good of the congregation, and it's for the good of each member that you're doing that, because you care about that member who is, hardly if ever seen at church. And if you're going to really care about them, you're going to do something about them, right? And so one way of it is just categorizing them. They use one of the congregations used colors, and red, caution, danger, at risk was for the color, was the color given to those who were the strayed, and the straying, and then they use other colors. Green was, or whatever, so basically you have to identify the people, right? That's kind of a first step. And then you develop programs, or you launch initiatives to reach them. Most congregations have a small group of elders, 4 or 5 people, some at the most, typically, oftentimes it's three elected elders. They're responsible for all the inactive people in the congregation. That's ridiculous. There's no way that 3 people, volunteers, can handle that massive number of people, especially in larger congregations. So it's not uncommon for us to recommend you need about 15 people, 20 people to really concentrate on that group of people. And here are the things that, this group is going to do this, these 5 people are going to do this, these 5, and finally, the most inactive, those that refuse to respond to all the efforts to raise them up, they become, maybe some church discipline is involved, and that's where maybe the elected elder or elders come into play along with one of the pastors or something like that. So hopefully I'm answering your question.
Well, I think we probably have that red list that you're talking about
Okay.
with our elders, but some of those other lists, like the spiritual growth, if they're in worship, how do we move them to Bible study? Are we getting those lists of names in front of us? Because unless you see a person's face, unless you see that name, it's pretty hard to target and invite intentionally. And I think that's where part of our gap is that we're trying to reach everybody and then we reach nobody.
Yeah, it's the shotgun versus the rifle approach. I shouldn't, not politically correct to use guns as illustrations, but because I grew up in hunting ducks and stuff like that. When you aim at the flock, you don't hit anything. You always have to pick out a particular duck and lead it appropriately, and then you get that duck. Because I grew up trying to shoot at the flock, my dad said, "Quit shooting at the flock, shoot at a duck." And, oh yeah, okay. So that's what we need to do. We need to zero in. We need to get focused. And one of the ways, just we're talking about worship and then Bible study, is tracking who is attending, who is participating in Bible study. You just track. Every time you have a Bible study, you have the name of that person there. And you pull all the names of people who are engaged in Bible studies. Those are the people who are in Bible studies. And now you know who's not. And now you develop a strategy, for bringing more into Bible study. And you, for example, take some of those who are already in Bible study and are loving it. You put those people out there. You send them out with a message. Who do you know that you can invite? You do video clips of positive, fun things happening in Bible study, and you show that during church. You just do those kinds of things because that's how you move them up.
And I think we've learned how to track metrics, the numbers, but we're not tracking the names.
Yeah, not tracking the names, I see. 10 minutes, huh? Good job, she even wrote it down so I could read it. No confusion there.
During the initial vision planning, we're not a church of 1,000, we're a church of 400, really is what we are. So if you use those numbers, those 400 and 500 numbers, those percentages increase pretty significantly, actually. We're actually, and I'm not a math guy, if anything, I'm not a math guy. But, that 1.8% becomes 3.6% if you cut the membership in half. Or as far as Bible study, it jumps to, 10% roughly? So, which is still not great, but it's still not, I don't know that these numbers are actually
Well, they're real in the sense that we're using your numbers to compare with Wells' numbers. And the Wells numbers have all the straying in them as well. So they're true in that sense. And really, you are a congregation of, what was the full membership? Thousands? You really are that, you really are a congregation, in one sense, you're a congregation of that size because that's who you're claiming as your members. Right? You're saying those are our members, and they're saying that's my church. So what you need to do, if you're going to increase the numbers and increase them so that they become more positive numbers, is you have to deal with the reality of having all those members who are inactive. And one of the things that hurts congregations the most, I served the congregation at Peace and Sun Prairie. When I came in, they had like 1,200 members on the books and 200 something in worship. And somebody said, it's going to be a challenge, Elton. It's like a sleeping giant, it's really sleeping, this church. And one of the reasons it fell asleep is that the bar was so low in terms of what's it take to be a member here. The bar was almost on the ground. There were no expectations. You could just sign up. you wouldn't even have to sign up. You want to join? Okay, we'll put you on. And there were 3 lists. None of them agreed. It was just chaos. Nobody really knew who were the members of the congregation. So one of my 5-year plans was figure out who the members are and regain every one of them. In the process of attempting to regain every one of them, we went from a congregation of a ridiculous number of 1,200 or whatever that membership was, several hundred fewer. But as the bigger number came down, the smaller numbers came up. Worship attendance, Bible study participation, all the positive indicators were coming up. And we were becoming a healthier congregation, even though we were becoming, with the big number, a smaller congregation. And we became, in a sense, leaner and meaner, and very positive things started to happen. We started a preschool. We started a Lutheran elementary school. We relocated. We ran out of space. We built on a couple times on our original lot. Still ran out of space, so we had to relocate to another part of town on 16 acres so that we could just continue to grow. And all of that happened because we were no longer satisfied with being that. And we wanted to be this. And so we started to figure out what it's going to take to become this. And it took a lot of work. When I was in my shoes at that time, the 2 big priorities were reclaiming every one of those people who had drifted away, even knowing full well that a lot of them won't be reclaimed because they want nothing to do with the church, really, and get more people in the Word more often. That was the strategy. Yes.
We have a question online here.
Yeah.
Do we have any software to track those members in Bible study, any records? And the answer is, with our new software, Church Community Builder, we do have that capability. So we have to use it that way,
Yeah.
but we have that capability, yes.
Yeah. And that's the power of planning, because once you set a goal, this is what we want this to look like in 3 years or 5 years or whatever. This is what we want membership to look like. This is what we want worship. I don't care, you pick it. You pick out anything you want to claim as a goal. Now you develop the path to get you to that goal. And then you use the resources, the software or whatever else. You form groups and you put together whatever it needs to take to get to that goal. That's how it works. That's why planning is so powerful. Yeah.
So Pastor, in the bottom of page 17 is this graph or this list of program priorities is ranked by members and leaders and pastors and staff. So I really got 2 questions. There's some diversity in there. Worship is one across the board. That makes some sense. But there's some diversity in there. So one of my questions is that common?
Yes.
And really, the focus on this thing that kind of jumps out, you in your team here 7 years ago, and now you pointed out you couldn't be more blunt to this congregation. Get your act together regarding adult spiritual growth, spiritual health. And you look at that line across there, and so our pastors rank that not as a top priority, they rank it number 4. And then you have the members that rank it as 2, but that's the same membership that only 5% of them are in Bible study.
People who are more active.
Yeah, so you
Fill
know,
out the
there
surveys,
seems to
yeah.
be some disconnect there too, so
Yeah.
I'm just curious what your
Yeah.
takeaway is.
Yeah, well, just on that particular adult spiritual growth line, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's real challenging. Each pastor, each person who filled out the survey was asked to pick the top 3 here. Now, we're gonna put worship other than a number 1 or a number 2, you know. And by the way, these program priorities will change depending on where the congregation is at a particular point in time. Now, almost all of our churches list worship as number 1, because that's the one thing they all have in common. The people who are filling out the survey is they value the worship experience, because you're praising God and you're receiving His means of grace. So that's almost always the highest priority. I don't think it's ever been lower overall in the congregation as a number 1 or 2. Ever in hundreds of churches that I've served. When it comes to something other than that, adult spiritual growth, I like it when I see 2s and 3s, and with the pastors, it's either a number 4 or number 5 because there was a tie there. What did the pastors pick as number? Worship, fellowship, and mutual love, which is a little different. I'm not faulting anybody. Maybe because of COVID, this is really on everybody's mind that we need to get back together again. That kind of thing that might have influenced where they were coming from. Equipping members, adult spiritual growth, and then farther down, outreach and so forth. These are just a snapshot of what your pastors were thinking about at that particular point in time, and what the leaders were thinking, what the part-time staff was thinking, and what the membership in general was thinking. And the only reason we do this is we just want to get that snapshot right there and lay it out in front of you and say, now raise questions, make comments, figure out why you're not on the same page on some of these. And out of that comes, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, we're gonna prioritize this. We need to convince this group of people that this is more important, those kinds of things. Yes.
I would comment as well that I think that the perspective is important, because there are issues that are really pastor-only kind of issues, and those are the ones that are ranked higher than the adult spiritual growth. And the adult spiritual growth, to an extent, should be handled by lay leaders.
Yeah, and from one perspective, almost everything should be handled by lay leaders and active members, because the primary role of the pastor, biblically speaking, is to train God's people for works of service so that the body of Christ can be built up. That passage in Ephesians. And anytime we think that something, the pastors own it, we're probably wrong. They own preaching and teaching. They're under shepherds under Christ. The time is up. I should quit. But I won't. I will, but not now. Your pastors are under shepherds of Christ. Christ is the overall shepherd. They're right under him. And elected leaders, I suppose, are right under him in terms of the responsibility and the authority for making things go right and conducting, and enabling ministry to happen. Okay, any other final thought or question? I don't want to cut anybody off. This is a quick review, but this is just the beginning of the discussion of this in a public setting. All of the information, this goes to every area of ministry, so people in outreach, you study your area, the section on outreach here, and you pull out of that or you benefit from that in any possible way that you can in the coming months and years. And every year, your ministry plan that gets formulated in that vision development event, and it goes through a couple of different steps there. You want to keep your vision fresh, of course, so you refresh it, you renew it every year. But all the input from the listening session, that's going to go to the leaders, you know, in working on maybe the guiding coalition and working on the vision for the future ministry. And then each area of ministry, like outreach, worship, and so on, gets all the input on worship goes to those involved with worship. All the information that comes in on your listening sessions for outreach goes to the people who are working with outreach. So there's going to be multiple benefits of that information that gets collected. All right, so is this a pretty accurate picture, this diagnostic analysis of Trinity at this point in time or in February?
Yeah.
It is?
Yeah.
Good. And this was Randy Hunter and Tim Glendy were my two associates. This was February 12th and 14th that we were here. I'm hoping that you would agree, because when there's not agreement, general consensus on things, then things get weird, like the steeples on that church. So the big question is, have we reached consensus? If we're united in, yes, this is where we are now, then we're prepared to start talking about the future. And then we're prepared to start talking about developing a ministry plan that'll lead us into the future.